It is late winter 2020. Greece announces a plan to erect nets in the Aegean Sea. There are too many Syrians. They are fleeing a civil war that erupted as displaced people became concentrated in hot cities during a drought. The nets will rise a meter out of the water to either catch or drown families. The crisis owes itself to a warmer climate. Nets don't discriminate. It is 1978. Exxon scientists discuss the greenhouse effect and predict the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Internal reports soon speak of widespread disaster, including multi-meter sea level rise and the flooding of Florida and Washington, D.C. An alerted public might force them to strand assets and shutter operations. Exxon launches a misinformation campaign nearly a decade before the public learns the term global warming. It is 1 month before a midterm election of 2018. The worst drought in decades sends a migrant caravan from the Northern Triangle north toward the southern border of the United States. Migrants wish to claim asylum. Conservatives simply accuse the migrants of harboring Islamic State terrorists. It is any time in the so-called War on Terror. Drone strikes hit school buses and wedding parties, and occasionally they hit resisting militants. Regions lie on the aridity line, that liminal zone where barely enough rain falls for crops, that winds across the African Sahel through the Middle East. Plot the advance of desertification to find where drones might soon lurk. The global north nervously whispers of approaching water wars, as if we are not already engaged. It is 1989 when an American electric company schemes to justify a coal plant with a new tool. They plant millions of non-native trees in Guatemala and threaten locals with prison if they are cut down for firewood. Almost nothing is captured of the emissions. The first carbon offset. It is 2004 when an oil company rebrands itself as green and launches one of the most successful advertising campaigns ever. BP teaches us to measure our iniquities by a carbon footprint. It is now in the near future. In Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in the world is critically full of Rohingya driven out of Myanmar. The location is vulnerable to cyclones and floods. The government relocates a substantial portion of the population from the current camp in Cox's Bazar to an island called Basan Char. The low island is not yet 20 years old, formed from silt from the Manga River. Already at high tide in a storm, the island could be submerged, even before the seas rise, that is. Authorities will move hundreds of thousands of refugees to an island that will be drowned. It is all happening so fast. The UN begs states to consider climate asylum cases, but there's no legal category for climate refugee. A billionaire tests equipment to unilaterally fill the sky with aerosols to deflect sunlight, a step towards geoengineering that is, to say the least, controversial and dangerous. Murderers of environmental activists reach new heights. States create laws to label activists as terrorists and suppress them with private mercenaries. Over a few months before the pandemic, liberal voters on both sides of the Atlantic reject leaders campaigning on the most ambitious climate legislation ever proposed. The Environmental Protection Agency gives its Climate Leadership Award to Raytheon. The Paris Agreement pretends there's hope for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming via non-binding pledges that will push us over 3. Indeed, the symptoms proliferate. Welcome back to the Future of Denial podcast. I'm Tad DeLay, and this second episode explores what psychoanalytic theory advances for understanding climate denial and its conversion symptoms. And a reminder, if listeners of this podcast order the book directly from Verso on their website, at checkout you can use the promo code DENIAL for 25% off the price. The passage I just read from my book a moment ago, skipping around the history, is, to my mind, a list of denials expressed as grifts and violence. How many of us believe in anthropogenic global warming? According to the latest data from Yale Climate Communication Program, 72% of adults in the United States believe the world is warming. Only 58% believe it's caused by human activity. Only 2/3 believe it will harm people in developing countries, and less than half believe it will harm themselves. About half Americans say they have personally experienced the effects of global warming, even though every single person has, from the scorching summers and winter polar vortexes to the price of your food and clothes when cotton and vegetable yields are dropping around 10% for every degree of warming. So the numbers are around half and half on the belief questions, and the answers shift around. For a while, belief was on a sharp rise, but recently belief in anthropogenic climate change among American liberals seems to be dropping. Belief won't inexorably rise over time. It could well be the case that as the changes ramp up, belief actually drops as people seek to rationalize their relatively comfortable positions built atop, as it is, the suffering of others. The United States is actually fairly typical on the questions of belief globally. Developed nations typically show more belief in anthropogenic climate change. However, American aversion to knowledge drops us down closer to a global average. But more importantly, my book argues that thinking in this Protestant mode, where correct thoughts are what saves you, is the wrong way to think about climate denial, because the material expressions of denial, aside from what thoughts circulate in people's heads, is what drives the brutality. My thesis, as I've said, isn't complex. Climate denial should be a flexible term designating a broad range of activity. Denial is best theorized as a tendency to negate threats in accord with material relations, generating symptomatic activity in order to justify, curate, and maintain regimes of power and material relations. I am interpreting denial as would a psychoanalyst, where blockages, delay tactics, acting out, and even budgetary concerns are read as forms of resistance. Now, I am a Freudian and a Lacanian in my theoretical orientation, and though psychoanalysis is seldom foregrounded in this book, the theory of the unconscious is everywhere in my work. Psychoanalysis gives us a series of categories for denial. A perverse fetish disavowal is not the same as the obsessional's negation of moral culpability or a neurotic conversion of psychic conflict into a physical symptom. The unconscious, it's important to say, is not a thing that exists so much as it is a dynamic principle, an indirect schema or model for thinking about how signifiers and drives resolve, hide, or otherwise conflict. How is it that we see what is about to happen? We have the necessary technologies to stop it, and yet we will not. It helps to have a theory of blindly irrational desire, of surplus enjoyment, of sadism and masochism, and maybe a death drive. In an essay on negation, which I use in my book to think about climate denial, Freud noticed this odd pattern patients engage in, where they say, you think this person in this dream, who is this, who are you asking who this can be? It's definitely not my mother, which Freud interpreted as, okay, so it is his mother. Amending the statement to an opposite was only the simplest form of denial. In another example, once people started catching on to the patterns, a patient said, I've got this new obsessive idea, and it occurred to me at once that it might mean so-and-so. But no, that can't be true, or else it would not have occurred to me. Here we have the basic structure of denial, the repressed idea becoming conscious, then the idea's negation. Negation, Freud argued, attests to the truth of the repudiated idea. Freud arrived at this formula. Negation is a way of taking cognizance of what's repressed, but not accepting what you see. So the emotive affect and the idea split and allow the affective or emotional component to remain repressed even as the patient consciously acknowledges the idea. You may notice, for example, how people talk about climate change in great detail as an idea, but the terror it should entail is nowhere on the surface. If you've paid attention, you've already clocked me as doing the same form of denial. If we were constantly bumping up against the repressed material without a way to flex or dynamically respond, our psyches would feel like prisons. Splitting the affect from the idea through negation, or peeling off what we feel from what we know, allows a bit of leeway. That's what a negative judgment does. To judge an act or thought negatively is akin to deciding, this is something I would prefer to repress. Freud, in his essay on negation, saw two categories of judgment that are crucial to our study of climate denial: First, a judgment asserts or disputes that a presentation has an existence in reality. In other words, all representations in the internal mind started off as some sort of external real, but the ability to remember something that once happened means that we have the ability to call forth an image or representation that is not, at least currently, real. Humans constantly call up memories to distort, test, or reject. But in this first form of denial, what the person is rejecting is reality itself. Second, a judgment can affirm or disaffirm the possession by a thing of a particular attribute. Freud described the second rejection as moral. Originally, the moral judgment might have been about practical usefulness as harm, such as good and bad food I wish to take into my body or spit out. The pleasure-seeking ego sought to introject anything into itself that is good and eject anything from it that's bad. And initially, bad means alien or external. So what does this mean? Climate denial is a type of negation and expresses itself through one of these two negating judgments. One tests and negates reality itself, while the other negates and rejects moral culpability or alien ideas. So two denials, reality denial and guilt denial. I joked last time that in the US we luckily have a major party for whichever mode of denial you prefer. How do we think of these two denials in relation to climate change? Well, the conservative denies reality and we mock them for it, sure. That's low-hanging fruit. It's a bit odd when a future Republican congressional representative, Marjorie Taylor Greene, dabbles in anti-Semitism and blames California wildfires on Jewish-funded space lasers, for example. But what about the time Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren made greening the military a central component of her presidential campaign, and as evidence pointed to the military's eco-conscious plan to reduce the amount of water used in their toilets? Or consider Elon Musk's Tesla. The first full year that the Tesla was profitable, it was made so by selling so many carbon credits to polluters that using the benchmark EU emissions trading system carbon price at the time meant that every Tesla purchased essentially authorized someone else to pollute the equivalent of 28 gasoline vehicle years. Entire companies like Delta Airlines claim to be carbon neutral by purchasing cheap forest offsets. And cities claim to be run 24/7 on carbon-free electricity by purchasing instruments called unbundled renewable energy certificates. There is a company called Yep You that lets you pay $17 per year to offset the carbon dioxide from your breath. And they let you pay to offset your dog or cat's breath as well. So yes, if you want to approach the climate crisis like a self-righteous Protestant, where believing the correct ideas gets you saved, if you want to be a Calvinist obsessing over your faithful good works so that you can prove one of the elect, then sure, we can damn the conservatives. But at the same time, the eco-conscious, well-meaning liberal is seeking salvation in toilets and bullshit. Repression is the vicissitude of the drive you're probably most familiar with. Nobody can seriously deny that they repress a great deal of their intrusive thoughts, their unwanted experiences, their unrelenting drives. And what's more, repression and the symptomatic return of the repressed are always one and the same. Freud's most famous example of repression came from watching his grandson play a game. One day when the mother was out of the nursery, the toddler was standing in his crib holding a string attached to a wooden reel. The boy would throw the toy from his crib, shouting "gone," before yanking the string to make the reel reappear while shouting "there." Back and forth, back and forth. The disappearance and reappearance were both part of the game, but the greater pleasure clearly came from the second act, the reappearance. On Freud's interpretation, in his passive helplessness, the child felt his mother's departure as stressful, so he compensated with an active game. Now, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan said that the boy clearly wasn't replacing the mother with the game. He knew she was gone, yet coped with a game. The game was a representative in the place of a missing representation. So this is how repression works. When two ideas or drives conflict, rather than one being simply preferred over the other, one idea remains conscious and the other becomes unconscious and generates symptoms. The boy wanted the mother. He also wanted security in her absence. Unable to satisfy both, her absence was made unconscious and he generated a game, an innocent symptom. Repression and the return of the repressed are two sides of the same coin. Repression always returns as something. From its origin, the mystical symptom was a conversion, that is, a conversion of conflict in the psyche that returns in the body. Contemporary medical literature no longer uses the term hysteria for this cluster of symptoms, the rashes, the anxiety, the aphasia, and so on. Indeed, these conditions are not necessarily clustered together at all in modern medical literature, but certainly modern medical literature still speaks of conversion disorder or functional neurological disorder, but psychoanalysts discovered it as early as the talking cure. The conversion symptom is an old idea worth hearing again. Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer were studying how the patient Anna O suffered physical symptoms from mental distress. In one case, she dreamed that a snake attacked her father, and ever after, the sight of a snake while she was gardening caused her arm to stiffen up. She sporadically lost her ability to speak in her native tongue, yet she retained use of another. These were conversion symptoms, from psyche to body. The conversion symptom is a return of the repressed. The psychoanalyst Bruce Fink listed minor aches and pains, tightness in the chest, a tingling sensation, a burning sensation, dizziness to migraines, paralysis, blindness, muteness, and deafness. Today, those resistant to psychoanalytic thought still complain of stress-related irritable bowel disorder. Of what am I trying to warn with all of this? Well, capitalism's carbon dependency creates denial in the form of pseudo-solutions, gimmicks, false promises, and quotidian violence. Much like repression leads to a symptomatic return of the repressed. You don't want to feel guilty for flying, or know that every seat on the plane costs twice the emissions of driving the same distance, so you buy a carbon offset that in practice probably means that some poor or indigenous population had their land bought out from under them and are now banned from cutting trees for firewood. But you don't want to think about that. You want your carbon offsets. You want to play 3-card Monty with the biosphere. In the future, a similar logic will drive the movement for so-called smart borders, with AI sentry drones liquidating climate migrants. The symptoms proliferate, ever more stupid and violent. So what are we to do? Isn't that always the question? You want a subject supposed to know, maybe allowing you to engage in moral masochism by telling you how sinful you are, but at any rate, a big other who can tell you what to desire. You wish for a subject supposed to know, that could tell you how to adapt to climate change or mitigate emissions as if you have any say against the law of capitalist accumulation. Lacan associated anxiety with the question, what does the big other want? To feel gripped with anxiety, that so-called fear without object, or maybe a fear of an object whose a traumatic intrusion in the real is real even if it doesn't exist. Well, that anxiety is all about the question of what am I to do? What does my partner, parent, boss, God, whatever, what does the big other want? A good question for climate anxiety in our times. Isn't that the question that's on everybody's mind? What can I do to help things? It's a type of reality denial. You cannot change what's about to happen, but it doesn't stop you from asking, what does the other want? What's asked of me? How am I to prepare for what's about to happen? Will my kids judge me for bringing them into a collapsing world? Ought I buy an electric vehicle or become a vegan? What am I supposed to do? What does the other want? The problem is that the demand pointed at the other never returns. You want a subject supposed to know, someone like a climate scientist, or maybe a humble humanities scholar, to tell you what to do, how to be pure, and so on. And maybe the liberal wants a manager supposed to handle it, or a cop supposed to arrest, but there's no answer coming, is there? Because you either don't have agency, or the options you do have are too boring or too terrible to contemplate. You could be a dedicated citizen attending municipal construction code meetings to support rules prohibiting natural gas boilers and water heaters on new buildings. Or you could take actions that are illegal. 1/5 of your carbon dioxide emissions will still linger in the air for 500,000 years. You don't like the thought that driving to get groceries means harming animals in the far future that haven't yet evolved. A moment ago, I formulated denial as a tendency to negate threats in accord with material relations, generating symptomatic activity in order to justify, curate, and maintain regimes of power and material relations. In my book, one way I explore what this means is through historical responses to plagues. Much of my early graduate work was in religious studies, and when you're studying religion, you're not only studying how people develop deeply meaningful, life-altering conviction based in trauma, social incentives, and wishful thinking. You're also regularly studying ideas or traditions that formed with plague in the background. At the start of the pandemic, I noticed analogies drawn between either COVID-19 and either plague or climate change. So such talk disappeared a few months in, which is interesting for different reasons, but we can use short-sighted COVID plague and COVID climate analogies paired with classic responses to plague as a heuristic for thinking about denial. The most famous case, of course, is the Black Death, breaking out in 1347. It spread too fast and nobody knew why. And one English monk explained that it was God's judgment for poor behavior of young women. He noticed that outbreaks happened often near tournament locations and deduced that that meant that women dressing up in men's clothes and following the games were to blame, pointing out that women were, quote, the showiest and most beautiful, though not most virtuous. So it was a response to sex stuff. Well-educated people knew that better. They blamed it on miasma, bad air. Others wanted to do what we might call evidence-based explanations. One Florentine polymath pointed to the skies, insisting that the plague was foretold by the masters in astrology last March. Parisian medical faculty agreed and said that the plague broke out at the exact hour of a major conjunction of the 3 planets in Aquarius. Still, many others blamed the Jews. The black rat and its fleas evaded blame, and so did the climate, with the world entering what we now call the Little Ice Age in a lead-up to plague, but whatever. In his book, The Great Mortality, historian John Kelly outlined 4 broad responses to plague. First, many retreated from others and isolated themselves, understanding plague to be communicable and thus social interaction a mortal risk. Second, many ignored caution and satisfied carnal cravings, wine, parties, orgies, songs, laughter, cynicism and irony, defending against despair. Third, some took a middle course between isolation and carelessness and preferred caution or risk mitigation. People carrying flowers and herbs in their hands or spices shoved into their noses. The bird-beaked plague doctor is a later invention, of course, but potions and scents were common mitigation technologies. When wandering out and about, people carried smelling apples. A popular remedy was to purchase unicorn horn and grind it up into a potion or drink. Some closed windows facing the direction from which they believed the bad air flew. Others cut up a serpent as a symbol of the devil and rubbed its carcass on their skin to draw the evil out of the buboes. The most amusing innovation in risk mitigation came from a physician who noticed that the attendants who take care of the latrines and those who serve in the hospitals and other malodorous places are nearly all considered to be immune. So imagine the Lord sniffing the latrines to keep safe. The final response was desertion. Those with means comfortably fled infected cities for the countryside, while impoverished peasants often had to move into the cities in hopes of work or better medical care if they fell ill. Families abandoned one another. Bleak records repeat sad scenes of parents abandoning infected children and vice versa. Some cities pioneered what we would now call public health. They screened incoming ships, shuttered on essential businesses, and adjusted funeral rituals. One town banned gambling, collecting money for the poor, and proclaimed a festival to win back God's favor. In other places, the plague was practically ignored. In Europe, the Jews suffered the worst. The myths of well poisoning sprawled into an elaborate mythical cast of evildoers deviously killing Christians. Pogroms in the past erupted at Easter time with myths of blood libel. Christians accused Jews of capturing children and inflicting twisted rituals of torture. During the plague, there was no day or night to the barbarism. Genoa and Strasbourg burned their Jewish populations as a type of brutal prophylactic measure. Fearful of contamination of the water, one town killed its Jews but sent corpses downriver in barrels. Many were tortured and beat to death. Reportedly in Worms, sensing their imminent murder, some Jews locked their doors and burned down their houses while still inside. All this lashing out, all this barbarism, was happening in full view. Lessons of the plague for our purposes are many, but among them is the enjoyment of pseudo-solutions in barbarism. Most importantly, the lesson is this. People responded in denial when they didn't have meaningful agency within the regimes of power under which they suffered. So what does all this mean for the years ahead? When the economies tank, when the unemployment and addiction skyrocket, when the supply lines buckle under stress, when the crops fail, when the flash floods and fires and shortages and polar vortexes and wet bulb temperatures and coral reef bleaching and wildfires and all the rest of it, what will happen when more and more people who tell themselves, "I never thought this could happen to me," do indeed suffer in the inexorable changes? What then? I live 15 minutes from the harbor, but my house is 70 meters above sea level. I need to worry about my house going under in maybe several thousand years, sure. But sooner than that, I think my neighborhood could be in real trouble. The extra energy trapped in the Earth's system boosts the hydrological cycle. More rainfall, stronger storms. What happens when basements or first floors start flooding regularly and homes lose maybe a third of their resale value in a year? Imagine the social tipping points when insurance companies go under and people can no longer protect houses that might not survive a 30-year mortgage. When people's homes, their primary investment instrument, decline in value, their property taxes drop, school funding and infrastructure suffer while police budgets balloon, the racism dials up, property devalues further, residents leave, the community suffers. How will liberals respond to all this? The reactionary nationalists, I figure, will have their calls for tariffs and blood. But what about the progressives who believe the science? Notwithstanding the American tendency to misclassify liberalism as a left-leaning position, liberalism is theoretically the center of the left-right spectrum. The right clings to hierarchy, capitalist, racist, misogynist, theocratic, and the left pushes toward egalitarianism. Theoretically centrist, yes, but liberals' support for individual liberties, such as speech, education, expression, religion, formal legal equality, plus liberalism's unwavering support for capitalist production and class hierarchies means its governance in practice veers center-right. Liberal leaders consistently align with the right against the left because they agree with the right on class oppression. For example, the liberal hates to discover that anyone is denied housing on account of race or sexual orientation, yet they feel that some people ought to be wage laborers while others deserve to extract as landlords, extracting rents. Liberalism's contradictions are irresolvable because the worker-owner distinction requires liberalism to pick a side. The liberals' deep conviction is that some hierarchies are natural or necessary, and they confess those convictions indirectly so as not to hurt their own feelings or damage self-righteousness. The basic function of denial is protection of the ego, that queasy, squirming basket of insecurity and anxiety that isn't fully censored from consciousness. Denial is a type of armor, and when repression begins to falter and the ego glimpses what it has done and how much more comfortable it has than the other 8 billion egos out there, it will deny its complicity in their suffering. It will buy up more carbon offsets, or green its militaries, or vote down school funding and divert resources to its police. Maybe the liberal ego will mock the medieval border wall while fast-tracking new smart border drone systems with artificial intelligence. For all the refugees who are about to displace in the greatest migration that has ever happened or ever will happen. To draw this to a close, the very last change that we made in final editing of my book was an acknowledgement of a catastrophe that, as of this writing, continues unrestricted. If you want a more vivid understanding of the climate horizon and its social fallout, just read about how Israel policed its borders with Gaza before the genocide when it used sentry drones and wall-mounted turrets. Decades of blockades, careful restriction of calories and medicine. Consider the West's steadfast support for Israel during all of this. And then consider the genocidal campaign after October 7th, the destruction of civilian life and infrastructure, the administered starvation of children. Think about that administered starvation and what it portends for unwanted people groups and populations judged to be economically superfluous. Or consider how civilian targets were reportedly generated by this AI program perversely called the gospel. I hope my heart is clear here, because I do not want to take focus off the current real suffering in Gaza. But I also want to point to this catastrophe as, I'm afraid, something that we may be seeing more of. States can liquidate unwanted people in full view of the West, including those liberals believers in science, those listeners to the marginalized, those knowers of what is practical and reasonable. Indeed, the symptoms proliferate. The age of denial is not over. We are just trapped in the quotidian malaise.